side of the House that this is an important matter. Again, there are things in this that are just rather galling. The fact that we hear endlessly about how many balanced budgets you've had as the debt continues to grow, and as you finance your operating year after year on the backs of our renewable resources, our royalties, and now our offset for the Atlantic Accord. It just goes on, Mr. Speaker. To go back to the forecasts, and there had been talk, and in fact, a meeting of the Economic Development Committee had looked very much at the forecast recently to try and glean a little bit of information about where this province is sitting in terms of our revenue and of our stability. The economic forecasts from 9 of the leading economic groups in the country show our growth for this year and next much lower than what the government is choosing to use as their assumptions. Now, Mr. Speaker, we're being told that the difference is solely a result of the stimulus package and the stimulus spending that hasn't been taken into account in these economic forecasts by the leading economists of the country. Mr. Speaker, I beg to question the government's judgment on this, because the stimulus package we're talking about here is over 3 years. It's normal spending, $1.2 million of normal spending, regular spending that's in line with what we've been doing for years, and it's $800 million of stimulus spending over 3 years. Half of that money is going to come, Mr. Speaker, from the federal government, and half from the province of Nova Scotia. But what we're seeing when we actually dig into the very rosy words of the minister today is that, in fact, they're counting a lot of things in their building for growth, I guess it is, that are things that, again, had already been announced, already underway. What we learned today is that in order to qualify for the stimulus package money from the federal government, it has to be a project that you can get underway within 2 years and complete within 2 years. That means a lot of the big road projects that are very exciting to Nova Scotians, the twinning projects and the 103 and the 104, those projects aren't falling under the government's economic stimulus plan. They're falling under other federal agreements, the money for which were flowing anyway. There are other agreements, other things that were in place, because the money has to go to something that can be built and delivered in a short period of time. So what we're seeing is a slight increase in the amount of paving that we will have this year under this plan, a slight increase. Mr. Speaker, we had a plan that would say that we'd have 2,000 kilometres of roads repaved over a 4-year period. And we were just under target on that a year or so ago. We did 475. We didn't make 500. And this year, we're on target to do 550 to 600. That's 10% above what you'd normally see, at best 20%. And so the stimulus package is allowing you to catch up where you were behind schedule the last couple of years. You're going to be able to catch up and achieve your 2,000 kilometres of paved roads. That's great to hit the target. We're glad. But you're doing it on the backs of a stimulus project when, in fact, it really is regular spending that you were planning to do at any rate. Mr. Speaker, good years in Nova Scotia have been squandered. During the years from 1999 to now, our budget has gone from $4.8 billion. It was only $4.8 billion in 1999-2000. It has ballooned to $8.65 billion in 08-09. That's a lot of extra spending, and I've questioned before in this House, do Nova Scotians really feel the impact of that additional spending? That it almost, 75% more in spending power in the good years when Nova Scotians' corporate and personal income tax were rising, and there was more money to put towards these very important programs in Nova Scotia. And during those good years, we did not maximize the benefit of that. We didn't start to decrease our debt until 2007-08, the only year that we saw any decrease in our debt. Our debt has continued to grow and grow. And this year is no exception, Mr. Speaker. This year, our debt is going to grow by $580 million. And that's by the government's assessment. That doesn't include the fact that we are not following our own legislation and reducing the debt based on the 08-09 budget year. That budget was very clear when we sat here a year ago and passed that budget. There was an expectation that over $200 million would be going to the debt through the offshore offset and also through our debt reduction plan, which was again set in stone. But how much of that was set in stone, Mr. Speaker? When you can come back here today and in the face of this as I say, more than misleading budget, you can be asked to then try and misconstrue the meaning of a deficit, change legislation that we're being asked to do in order to help the government redefine their whole world of finance so that they can present what they can stand up and say is a balanced budget. Mr. Speaker, we've said we're not prepared to go retroactively to see that happen. If the times have changed, and they have, we've looked across the country, only 2 provinces have brought in a surplus budget out of all the provinces I've spoken of. Definitely, we're in a recession across the country, and although Nova Scotia is doing better than some other places, and I do acknowledge that, and I'm delighted to say so, we still have to recognize it's a different time. But you don't go back retroactively and change the rules like that. You look forward, you say, where are we today? The government went out of its way to take spending from this coming year, the year we're in now, put it onto last year when they had better revenues, and use their offshore offset to cover that off. That's just not right, Mr. Speaker. It's not right. It's playing monkey business with the budget. That's all it is. It's smoke and mirrors. It's a shell game. You can use any one of the many cliches you'd like to use, but it's asking us to sort of turn away and not pay attention to what these numbers are all about. Because the hour and a half that we heard the Minister of Finance speaking was an awful lot of backslapping and an awful lot of just fiction and fantasy. And I hope the members across see it for what it is. And I hope your discussions have highlighted that as well. The legacy of John Hamm was that he achieved the offshore agreement with Ottawa, that he brought money to the province, that he promised to put on the debt, that he recognized we had the 2nd highest per capita debt in the country, and he wanted to do something for the future. It was extraordinary income. It was a gift in a sense because we had waited a long time for it. And now we want to use it to fund the bread and milk that we need every day. We're using it for the day-to-day spending, and that's not what it was ever intended for. As I say, John Hamm had the foresight to say that it was for something bigger, for actually positioning us for the future. Mr. Speaker, our province desperately needs vision, a vision that will set us up in Nova Scotia for better prosperity in the future, not just more of the same and treading water. That's all we see from this government is more of the same. I don't see an investment here in any of the stimulus that's discussed that really positions us to benefit from any of our other resources, from developing green energy, from positioning new industry here. I just see us building some roads, and as I said, that's smoke and mirrors too, because it isn't the big projects. It is the ongoing maintenance and repaving of roads that we're talking about here. And as important as that is, it's 10% more in the number of kilometers that we're talking about in this fiscal year. Mr. Speaker, I fail to see how 10% or even 20%, if you get lucky, is going to in any way equal a major stimulus project in this province. I think that the reason we have such scant details, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. It's getting hard to hear the Speaker. The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park has the floor.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, the reason that it is smoke and mirrors is that this document, and I'm just talking about the summary one now, which talks about building for growth, has very misleading information. For example, the line about schools that are going to be built is one. It references specifically $307 million will be invested to build 8 new schools and upgrade another 41. Mr. Speaker, we know that announcement's been made by the government that there are going to be 8 new schools and 41 renovations. But, Mr. Speaker, this $307 million to be spent this year does not include those projects. This money is being spent on the continuation of the 2003 promises, which coincidentally preceded an election as well, which we expect this year, no doubt. It's past commitments that are being brought forward. Mr. Speaker, this is very misleading. I think anybody can look into that and find that this is not the current announcement for new schools. And again, Mr. Speaker, those costs, those new schools will not be ready for construction in the 2 years required under the federal government's support for stimulus under this current economic climate. So it's just putting two things that are not connected together. That's just not right. And I find that extremely misleading. We did ask to get more information on that, and that's what we've been told, definitely. Again, Mr. Speaker, we just feel that there's scant details on the building for growth. It's a lot of rhetoric. It's a lot of fine words. It doesn't mean anything. It's just not something that we have any belief in that it's going to come to fruition. And Mr. Speaker, there are a lot of things that we are concerned about. Again, as I say, the forecasts that we believe are overly rosy, not based on fact. The fact that you see personal income tax going down while you're saying that both employment and unemployment will go up and unemployment will go down, they sort of fly in the face of each other. Mr. Speaker, there are a lot of other revenue pressures on us which haven't been mentioned much by the minister. He spoke about equalization being challenging, and our equalization is in fact flat. It provides 20% of our revenue every year, but we have a new formula that was thrust upon us and accepted by this government, and we are going to be even more stressed next year. The government was able to get one commitment for this year. I don't believe we've seen the money yet, but there seems to be a commitment. That takes us through this year, which again, coincidentally might be an election year, but there's no promise that next year there'll be any help at all. And we know that the current formula, where the pool of equalization money is now going to be capped, we know that Ontario is now drawing from that pool, and it will not be as good a year in the future for us in terms of equalization. That provides an additional stress to all of us. And Mr. Speaker, again, with the debt going up by $580 million, with only 1 year going down, it has to be repeated that very good years were squandered, and that the debt reduction plan that was announced again with fanfare in 2003 and updated in 2005 was never realized. Was never stuck to. And here we have the government that actually many of their members sat with John Hamm, and they're willing to squander his legacy, which was to see the future of Nova Scotia stronger, our financial stability greater. And Mr. Speaker, while we're talking about the debt and the stimulus package, I think it's very important to note how the mechanics of the federal money, particularly for roads, are going to work, or roads and infrastructure. They flow into the province, Mr. Speaker, from the federal government under a category that is known as TCA. It's, I just have to find here, TCA, cost shared revenue is what it's called, and that's tangible capital assets. That's what TCA stands for. And this year it shows it went from 45 million in the forecast to 166. Is that million? Anyway, it's gone up a whole lot, over $100 million, Mr. Speaker, over $100 million. I think that speaks to Nova Scotians. But, Mr. Speaker, that money is being dropped directly into our operating budget. It is funding our operating budget. It's directly offset by the expenses of this province. So I would liken that to getting a car where they offer you a rebate of $100 or $1,000 rebate, and instead of putting the $1,000 on the car, I spend the $1,000 on my mortgage and my food and my ongoing expenses, and I still have the full cost of the car. And that explains, Mr. Speaker, why our debt this year is going up $580 million, because we're financing the whole thing through debt for our own portion of the capital stimulus and the federal government's portion, and we are spending the federal government portion as it comes in. We're spending it on the regular programs of this province, and I think that should be examined by all Nova Scotians, that kind of planning is going underway so that we're seeing the government congratulate itself and boast about its good planning when in fact we're using the offshore offset to fund our regular spending. We're using the federal stimulus dollars on our regular spending. We're using the Crown share and any surplus that should have gone to the debt on our regular spending. Mr. Speaker, we are not looking after the future of this province by doing so. And we're being asked to break the law by changing the Provincial Finance Act to redefine what a deficit is. We've got a finance minister who's hedging around about whether or not this is a deficit budget. And make no mistake, it is, with a deficit budget in this year and finishing last year in a deficit position, if the truth were told. And it's about time that there was more truth-telling here in the House, Mr. Speaker. We've got tremendous cost pressures coming up. We realize that. And at the same time, we're trying to redefine the way we calculate our own books in this province. And Mr. Speaker, I think that we need to talk a little bit about Liberal priorities, which have been to stimulate small business and to help the economy, which is where Nova Scotians, and the minister spoke about it, Nova Scotians are resilient, Nova Scotian people are strong, and we want to see that they have the tools to help set their own house in order and to keep hiring and employing Nova Scotians. That's the future for this province, Mr. Speaker. But today what we saw in front of us, we believe is faulty, it's misleading, it is self-congratulatory to a government that has failed to manage this province, failed to provide any kind of a vision and a future. Mr. Speaker, I believe that we've been very clear on this side, and the Liberal caucus and my leader has been very clear that we will not be party to changing a bill on the Provincial Finance Act retroactively. We are not prepared to do that, Mr. Speaker. We are prepared to see where the government wants to go in this next few days, and certainly we will continue to debate this budget, to point out the misleading aspects of it as we go forward, to seek clarification if we have that opportunity, and to look for a better vision for the future of Nova Scotia. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The estimates are referred to the Committee of the Whole House on Supply. We will now refer back to the daily routine. Presenting and reading petitions. The Honourable, the member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on a point of privilege today. As I understand that after I left this House on Friday afternoon, there were concerns raised that I might have misled the House in a resolution which I presented on the forest fires in Halifax Atlantic. My resolution was prepared from the facts available to me and to other residents of that portion of the evacuated area. And I understand that the Minister subsequently has clarified the actions of the Department of Natural Resources in this House. I would like to make it very clear, through you, to the Minister and to this House, that my intention was never to mislead the House or in any way to call into question the Minister's personal or professional integrity. And if she feels this to have been the case, then I am very sorry, and I do extend my apologies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Presenting and reading petitions. Presenting reports of committees. The Honourable the Deputy Premier on an introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I want to draw members' attention to the East Gallery, where we have two individuals from Inverness County who have a very keen interest in the proceedings today. They are Alec Angus MacDonald and Elizabeth Ann MacDonald. And their interest in today's proceedings is that they have watched their son's Minister of Finance present today's budget. They are the parents of the Honourable Rodney MacDonald, Premier of this province, Mr. Speaker.
Seemed to be a fair amount of blushing going on up there. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. The Honourable the Minister of Agriculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I table notice of fee presented in accordance with Section 4 of Chapter 8 of the Acts of 2007, the Fees Act.
Reports, regulations, and other papers. The Honourable the Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage on an introduction.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have a couple of friends, members of my association in from the Eastern Shore today, and I would ask all members in the House to please show their warm affection and welcome to Mr. Bernie Day and Tom Campbell.
Statements by ministers. I think we pretty well covered that. Government notices of motion. The Honourable the Premier.
Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the swift reaction of all firefighters involved in last week's fire in the Purcell's Cove, Herring Cove area proved once again how fortunate we are to have these professionals always at the ready to protect our communities. And whereas, while it is devastating for those families who lost their homes and cherished belongings in the fires, many have rightly noted that it certainly brings into perspective what is truly important when no one was injured in the ordeal. Whereas not only did this community rise to assist their neighbours, groups like the Canadian Red Cross work day and night to provide shelter for the evacuees, providing needed comfort for those dealing with such a stressful situation. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House salute the efforts of our firefighters, both provincial and municipal, and the team from New Brunswick, and thank all groups involved, like the Red Cross, in assisting the evacuees, and especially wish the affected victims our best as they now pick up the pieces and rebuild their homes and their lives. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? The motion is carried. The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas as we begin another sitting of deliberations over legislation, it is a good opportunity to recognize the return of Gordon Johnson to the Legislative Council office. And whereas just a few months ago Gordon underwent serious cardiac surgery but appears to have made a tremendous recovery and is again working alongside his colleagues with the mammoth task of drafting legislation. And whereas the important work of our Legislative Council office continued in his absence thanks to the hard work of all staff. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House welcome back this hard-working individual and wish Gordon all the best as he continues to recuperate since his return to the job. Mr. Speaker, I request a waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? The motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Justice.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. May I be permitted to do an introduction before my resolution?
Please do.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in the East Gallery today, I have a constituent from Cape Breton North that's here in Halifax for some appointments. And in your gallery, I'd like to introduce Jerome Murin from North Sydney. And Jerome, if you would rise, receive the warm welcome of the House. Welcome. And also, Mr. Speaker, if I could continue to be permitted, someone from Inverness County that's no stranger to this House, but she definitely is new to being a grandma, and that's Bonnie McIsaac. And Bonnie, welcome to the House today. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the province of Nova Scotia is committed to employment equity and promoting diversity in the workplace, and whereas the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission has commenced the Employment Equity Partnership Project to create more discussion with employers, researchers, and communities across the province about employment equity issues. And whereas the Human Rights Commission is promoting the Employment Equity Partnership with 15 partner organizations and communities across the province who have signed on, therefore be it resolved that the House of Assembly congratulate the Human Rights Commission on the promotion of the Employment Equity Partnership, and that members continue to encourage all Nova Scotians to promote and protect human rights in their communities. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister for Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on April the 20th, 2009, a 5-ton truck struck a toll booth on the Cobequid Pass, which was occupied by toll booth attendant Mr. Stuart Mills. And whereas having seen the imminent danger of the approaching truck, Mr. Mills acted quickly and selflessly, advising the drivers of 2 vehicles in his lane to move immediately so they could avoid danger. And whereas when the truck hit the booth, Mr. Mills sustained multiple injuries, including cracked ribs, cuts, and bruising. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House acknowledge Mr. Stuart Mills for the bravery and heroism displayed in protecting the safety of his patrons and collectively wish him a full and fast recovery from his injuries. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? The motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 1 in 5 Canadians is affected by mental illness in his or her lifetime, and whereas each year the Canadian Mental Health Association provides support services to more than 100,000 Canadians through the combined efforts of more than 10,000 volunteers and staff, and whereas mental health professionals in the province's 9 district health authorities and the IWK provide treatment services in our hospitals and in our 50 community mental health clinics, therefore be it resolved, all members of the House recognize May 4th to 10th as Mental Health Week and acknowledge the work done by these dedicated individuals. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister for the Status of Women.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Transition House Association of Nova Scotia has worked tirelessly for 20 years to make the lives of women and their children safer, and whereas transition houses improve women's health and well-being, improve their economic security, ensure their freedom from violence, and expand their hopes and dreams, and whereas the Transition House Association is a leading voice in the fight against domestic violence, therefore be it resolved that all members of the House recognizes the 20th anniversary of the Transition House Association of Nova Scotia and commends its members and staff for their commitment and dedication to making Nova Scotia a better place to live for women and their children. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? The motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister for African Nova Scotian Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Dr. Abdullah Kumara and the team at Biomedica Diagnostics were the recipients of the 2009 Technology Pioneer Award by the World Economic Forum, and whereas Dr. Karomera and the Biomedics Diagnostics continue to develop medical technology that continues and contributes to the good health of Nova Scotians, Canadians, and indeed the world, and whereas his incredible ingenuity and entrepreneurial spirit allows him to remain a world-leading research scientist in the fields of medical diagnostics. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of the House congratulate Dr. Abdullah Karomera and Biomedica Diagnostics for their continued scientific excellence and being named the recipient of the 2009 Technology Pioneer Award. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? The motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Nova Scotia Federation of Anglers and Hunters held their annual general meeting in Bridgewater on March 28th, and whereas the Learn to Fish program introduces youth from across the province to angling, providing them with the skills and the knowledge needed to enjoy responsible sport fishing for a lifetime. And whereas the Nova Scotia Federation of Anglers and Hunters recognized the Learn to Fish program with their annual Farron Hickman Award. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House congratulate staff of the Department of Fisheries and Aquaculture and the Department of Natural Resources, as well as volunteers in the angling community, for winning this award for the Learn to Fish program. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Joggins Fossil Centre opened for its second season of operation on Earth Day, April 22nd, and for its first full season since being accepted as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And whereas the Department of Natural Resources, along with the Departments of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism, Culture and Heritage, and the Cumberland Regional Development Authority have continued to support the site to preserve its natural beauty. And whereas employees at Joggins Fossil Centre are committed to providing a positive experience so that the site can be enjoyed by Nova Scotians as well as visitors from around the world. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House take a moment to congratulate Joggins Fossil Cliffs for being recognized as one of Nova Scotia's best tourist attractions and wish the employees and volunteers all the best during the season. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister for Health Promotion and Protection.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas we recognize Mike Stevenson, teacher at G.R. Saunders School, for leading their most recent Heart and Stroke Foundation fundraiser. Whereas we also recognize Mr. Stevenson for his outstanding volunteer commitment to Heart and Stroke since 2006. Whereas we recognize the students at the school for raising $7,600 for the annual Jump Rope for Heart campaign, the largest contribution of any school in Pictou and Ignition Gainsborough counties. Therefore, it be resolved that all members of this House recognize the outstanding commitment of Mike Stevenson and the students at G.R. Saunders School for their commitment to fundraising for heart and stroke. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister for Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Clean Nova Scotia is helping Nova Scotia Environment create awareness about the litter problem in Nova Scotia. And whereas Clean Nova Scotia is encouraging local residents to visit the website www.bestthingyou'llneverdo.ca to pledge to never litter. And whereas they are doing their part to help make Nova Scotia litter-free through the province-wide Great Nova Scotia Pick-Me-Up. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House join the people of Nova Scotia in congratulating Clean Nova Scotia for their help with our Best Thing You'll Never Do campaign. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister for African and Nova Scotian Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Dr. Pearline Oliver was a formidable advocate for women's rights in the African Nova Scotian community for more than 60 years, and whereas Mrs. Oliver consistently argued for women's equality in nursing by collecting struggling nurses' stories of workplace obstacles and translating them into lessons in opportunity, awareness, and social change. And whereas in July of 2008, the highly decorated Mrs. Oliver passed away at the age of 91, leaving the community she shaped to grieve her loss and celebrate the professional and racial barriers she eradicated. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House pay their respects to the incredible legacy of Pearline Oliver and her years of dedicated service to the African Nova Scotian communities and the manner in which she reshaped this province for the better. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister for Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Instructor of the Year Award is an annual award that is given to the Hunter Education Instructor who goes above and beyond the required teaching standards of the Hunter Education course. And whereas the award was originally introduced in 1994 to recognize and acknowledge instructors who excel at the delivery of the program and for those that take the extra time to make the course a positive learning experience for the young and old alike. And whereas this year's winner, Wayne Mullins, has taught the Hunter Education course for the past 22 years with Shelburne County Fish and Game and is being honored for his innovative teaching practices and the positive light that he sheds on the hunting community both in and out of the classroom. Therefore, be it resolved that the province of Nova Scotia congratulates Wayne Mullins for his dedication to the Hunter Education course and the promotion of safe hunting practices. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Emily Rosta, a grade 9 student at Donkin Morian Elementary Junior High School and a talented writer, whereas Miss Rosta was the winner of the Royal Canadian Legion Nova Scotia Nunavut Command Remembrance Day Essay Contest for her essay honouring the efforts and sacrifices of Canada's veterans, whereas her essay titled "Sometimes It Takes Forgetting to Make Us Really Remember" will move on to be judged in the nationwide competition. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House sincerely congratulate Emily Rosta for being an award-winning essayist and for honouring the important role that our veterans played in ensuring Canada's continued freedom. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister for Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Peter LeBlanc and his wife Emily have continued to support 4-H despite their children having finished the programme. And whereas 9 individuals from across Canada were selected for the Cooperative 4-H Leader of the Year Award, and Peter LeBlanc of River Bourgeois was one of the recipients. And whereas Peter LeBlanc was also recognised with this award for his more than 25 years of volunteering with 4-H, especially with Camp Rankin. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House recognise Peter LeBlanc and his wife Emily, as well as all 4-H volunteers across the province, for their tremendous commitment. I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas working with our health system partners to reduce wait times in all areas is a significant focus with Nova Scotia Department of Health, and whereas in April Premier MacDonald turned the sod to expand the Cape Breton Cancer Centre, which will reduce wait times for cancer treatment, and unveiled a new CT simulator to help reduce wait times for cancer diagnosis, and whereas the Cape Breton Regional Health Hospital Foundation has committed to raising $2 million for the expansion. Therefore, be it resolved, this House join me in thanking Cape Breton District Health Authority in working with the department to provide Cape Bretoners with safe, appropriate care close to home. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. Honourable the Minister of Environment.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that at a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Mr. Leo Buzan, staff janitor at Brooklyn Elementary School in Sydney, works hard every day to keep the school clean and tidy. And whereas he strives to ensure the health and safety of the students and staff at the school. And whereas Mr. Buzan is a valued staff member of the school who takes pride in his job and his school. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House join the people in Nova Scotia in congratulating Mr. Buzan at Brooklyn Elementary, and indeed all janitors, for helping to create a safe and clean environment for the students and staff, not only at Brooklyn Elementary School, but all our schools. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Charlotte Green suffered the tragic and heartbreaking loss of her young son, and through such a tragic loss saw an opportunity to bring joy into the lives of impoverished children, and whereas Ms. Green has focused on her son's love of books and decided to build a memorial library at a Guatemalan orphanage. And whereas she and 36 parents and teachers from Northumberland Regional High School traveled to South America in March of 2009 to give the children there the gift of literature. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House sincerely commend Charlotte Green and the students, parents, and staff of Northumberland Regional High School for turning a tragic loss into a wonderful gift for the children of Guatemala. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Agriculture.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. whereas Kevin Grant was a strong supporter of the Nova Scotia 4-H program, and in his honour, the Kevin Grant Memorial Tour was founded, and whereas the Kevin Grant Memorial Tour was an opportunity for 4-H youth to learn about several communities, meet community leaders, and visit resource-based businesses and rural employers, and whereas 10 4-H members from across the province were selected to take part in this year's Kevin Grant Memorial Tour to communities in Cape Breton. Therefore, be resolved that all members of this House congratulate the 10 4-H members who took part in this tour and encourage them to consider a future in one of the communities they visited. I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. Introduction of bills. Notices of motion. The Honourable the Member for Halifax Atlantic.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas forest fire broke out last week in the eastern half of the Chebucto Peninsula, and in less than 48 hours, 8 homes were destroyed, others were damaged, and some 2,000 acres of forest consumed, although mercifully no human lives were lost. And whereas shifting winds and dry conditions made these fires a very real threat to several communities, including Herring Cove, Purcell's Cove, Long Pond, and Jollymore, forcing the evacuation of some 1,200 people. And whereas firefighters, police, helicopter and water bomber pilots, countless volunteers and staff of the Department of Natural Resources Emergency Measures Organization, Halifax Regional Municipality, Salvation Army, Red Cross and others were all working valiantly on and behind the scenes to control the wildfires and where necessary to make comfortable both people and pets displaced from their homes. Therefore be it resolved that this House of Assembly thank and congratulate all those who worked so hard in the face of last week's fires on the Chebucto Peninsula with all resources at their disposal and hope no part of this province faces such conditions again. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I present this resolution on behalf of the member from Annapolis. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas this past weekend, over 3,000 Liberals met in Vancouver to nominate their new leader, Michael Ignatieff, and whereas Mr. Ignatieff, the Member of Parliament for Etobicoke Lakeshore, accepted the role to a number of standing ovations, and whereas the Liberal Party of Canada is strong, united, and ready to offer Canadians the leadership they deserve. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House of Assembly join in congratulating Michael Ignatieff on being named leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. Mr. Speaker, I would ask for waiver of notice.
Send our condolences to
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas National Volunteer Week 2009, celebrated April 19th to 25th in Nova Scotia, recognized people in their communities who take action and solve problems. And whereas Nova Scotia has 377,000 volunteers, the third highest total per capita in Canada, and whereas one of those 377,000 volunteers is Mr. Chuck Spinney, treasurer of the Crowdis Mountain Snowmobile Club and Zone 1 vice president for the Snowmobile Association of Nova Scotia, who helped organize an exceptionally successful first Silver Dart Snowmobile Rally in February. Therefore, be it resolved that MLAs in this Nova Scotia legislature applaud the dynamic efforts of one Chuck Spinney for his recognition by the Municipality of Victoria as their 2009 Volunteer of the Year. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption
Excuse me.
of the following resolution. Can you hear me now?
That's better. Can you hear me now?
Start over?
The Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on Saturday, May 9th, 2009, Camp Harris celebrates its 50th anniversary as a member of the Dartmouth area of Canada Scouts. And whereas Camp Harris, located on Mineville Road, has provided a place for thousands of scouting members, schools, various youth organizations, and local businesses to fundraise and conduct outdoor activities like planting trees and other environmental programs. And whereas during this year's 50th anniversary celebration called Scout Trees, the Dartmouth area Scouts of Canada and the Camp Harris Committee will address some of the damage caused by Hurricane Juan by planting 6,000 trees on the property of Camp Harris. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the legislature congratulate Camp Harris on its 50th anniversary, commend the many scouting members who have been part of the Dartmouth area Scouts of Canada over the years, and thank the many donors and businesses throughout Halifax Regional Municipality who have contributed so generously. And, Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? The motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Kings West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Avro Anson first flew on January 7, 1935, and production finished after 11,020 Ansons were built, including 1,832 Anson Mk-11s built in Canada. And whereas Avro Anson serial number 7135 was one of 340 Anson Mk-11 aircraft built by Canada Car Foundry Company of Amherst, Nova Scotia. And whereas Mr. Lloyd Graham asked Colin Ainsworth to assemble a team, one who enjoyed 15,828 hours restoring a part of Nova Scotia's wartime heritage for the Greenwood Military Aviation Museum. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House congratulate Lloyd Graham for his outstanding leadership and contribution to Nova Scotia's wartime heritage and an aviation history celebrating 100 years of flight, and extend best wishes in his new role as Honorary Colonel of 404 Long Range Patrol. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice, passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Elizabeth Lizette York, a native of Hillside Bulledry, Cape Breton, has been named a member of USA Today's newspaper 2009 All-USA College Academic First Team, and whereas York is a senior biology major in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of North Carolina, and is the only Canadian listed on this prestigious list. Whereas Lizette is presently awaiting an honours thesis on molecular biology and immunology, and is hopeful of becoming a doctor while volunteering in the burn unit of University of North Carolina hospitals visiting disfigured patients. Therefore, be it resolved that all MLAs in this Nova Scotia legislature applaud the diligent work ethic of Lizette York while offering congratulations to her proud parents, Elizabeth and Charles York, who is the principal of Bulledry Elementary School in Victoria County. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas supporters, students and staff of Dartmouth High School work together on the concert for Keating Hall to raise $4,000 to improve the sound and lighting equipment for the AV room. And whereas the entertainers for the benefit concert and auction included Sam Moon, Rick Gautreau, Jamie Gaddy, Steve Dukes, and JP Arsenault. And whereas the concert also highlighted the incredible talents of Dartmouth High's trebled youth, clarinet ensemble, Rhea Kim, and Paradise Project, Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate organizers Rick Gautreau, Dave Matthews, and Ruth Dowden, host Don Connolly, and all the volunteers, entertainers, sponsors, and donors who contributed to the success of Dartmouth High's concert for Keating Hall, April 20th, 2009, and thank them for this support for the school and our community. Mr. Speaker, request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Digby-Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas emergency room closures have been an issue for the residents of Digby for many years now, and whereas last Wednesday the Southwest District Health Authority put out a release stating that Digby General ER would be closed for 121 hours in the month of May, and whereas now that a solution has been given to the Lillian Fraser, perhaps the Minister of Health can bring forward solutions for the Digby General and many other hospitals facing ER closures in this province. Therefore, be it resolved, the Minister of Health act immediately to bring an end to the chronic ER closures taking place throughout Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Deputy Premier. You're on.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Kevin Concannon graduated from St. Francis Xavier University with a Bachelor of Arts degree, and whereas over his career Kevin has been Director of 4 Health and Human Services in 3 different states, as well as holding many national leadership roles in the United States, and it is in this capacity that I renewed my acquaintance with him through joint membership in the Reform States Group. Whereas President Barack Obama announced his intent to nominate Kevin Concannon as Undersecretary for Food, Nutrition, and Consumer Services at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House join me in congratulating Kevin on this prestigious nomination. Mr. Speaker, I seek waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Halifax Citadel, Sable Island, on an introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the West Gallery today is Lauren Mills. Lauren Mills is very committed to the democratic process and has been very involved in politics. And she volunteered in my office last month and provided the background that led to the drafting of this resolution. I'd like to welcome her to the House. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 2009 is the Jubilee anniversary of the Halifax Grammar School, and whereas for the past 50 years the Halifax Grammar School has developed a reputation for excellence in education, and whereas the Halifax Grammar School will be celebrating this golden anniversary by having a gala dinner and dance on May 30th, 2009 to establish an endowment fund for scholarships and bursaries, therefore be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate the Halifax Grammar School on its 50th anniversary and for using the occasion to reaffirm its commitment to making a grammar school education as affordable and accessible as possible. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? Agreed. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas in a press conference last week, the Premier stood behind a podium bearing the slogan, "Proven record for economy first." Whereas in his 3 years leading this government, the Premier has proven that he is unable to manage our economy in good times or in bad. Whereas instead of putting the economy first, this Premier has consistently acted in a manner that puts the personal political gain ahead of what really matters. Therefore, resolve the Premier and his campaign team replace their slogan with, "Don't worry, we will spend, and put Nova Scotians deeper in debt than they've ever been. Mr. Speaker, I'd ask for waiver.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? I hear several noes. The motion is tabled. The Honourable the Minister for Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, after I read the resolution, I also would like to make a quick introduction. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Michael Kidd, founder and executive director of Nuts for Ribs, recently received the National Special Recognition Award from the Canadian Cancer Society for his work on nuts for ribs. And whereas 900 new testicular cancer cases will be diagnosed in Canada this year, of which 30 young men will die. And whereas the Nuts for Ribs Board of Directors and event volunteers have taken this seriously and sometimes embarrassing topic and raised significant funds for testicular cancer research and created awareness for young men, hopefully saving their lives and making a difference in our province. Therefore, be it resolved, the members of this House congratulate Michael for winning this special recognition award and wish the Nuts for Ribs Board of Directors continued success in their undertaking. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage on an introduction.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this time I would like to introduce Mr. Kidd, my EA, in the auditorium. Thank you very much.
The Honourable the Member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Gavin Douglas, Christy Allen, and Dara DeYoung of Northumberland Regional High School in Alma, Pictou County, organized an impressive event to raise awareness about the plight of child soldiers in Uganda. And whereas Gavin, Christy, and Dara persuaded other students, teachers, and local politicians to participate in this important event. And whereas over 50 students took part in this rally, part of a worldwide demonstration to raise awareness about Uganda children who are abducted and forced to be soldiers. Therefore, be resolved that the members of this Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate Gavin Douglas, Christy Allen, and Dara DeYoung of Northumberland Regional High School for their good work on raising the public's awareness about the tragic situation of child soldiers in Uganda and wish them success in their future endeavours. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Minister for the Public Service Commission.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas volunteers are people from all walks of life and all ages with a common desire to make a difference in their community and in their own lives by giving their time and expertise, and whereas volunteers in Bedford are the lifeblood of our community, providing support in virtually every aspect of society, including health, education, social services, youth, sports and recreation, culture, arts, and the environment. And whereas Caitlin Whitehouse was recognized as Bedford's Youth Volunteer of the Year by the Bedford Volunteer Recognition Committee for her selfless act of giving to her community, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House recognize the invaluable efforts made by all volunteers in their communities and congratulate Caitlin Whitehouse for her contribution to the people of Bedford. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable the Member for Waverley Fall River Beaverbank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I should move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Constable June Chason has been an RCMP officer for 11 years, most recently serving as the Community Policing Coordinator for Fall River and Beaverbank, and whereas during her years as a community police officer, Constable Chason initiated programs and events such as the Scarlet Soiree, which aims to help women at risk of domestic abuse, and the Beaverbank and Fall River Seniors Academy, a continuing education program for seniors. And whereas at the end of May, Constable Chason is transferring to Ottawa as a corporal continuing in community policing. Therefore, be it resolved that this House of Assembly recognize RCMP Officer June Chaison's outstanding contributions to her community and wish her well on her transfer to Ottawa. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister for Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the human swine influenza was diagnosed in Canada at King's Hitchhill School in Windsor just over 1 week ago, and whereas the spread of such an influenza in a small school and in a town such as Windsor, let alone the entire continent, resulted in a week requiring strong leadership by the headmaster Joe Seagram and the staff at King Hitchhill School, local health care workers and first responders, as well as the town of Windsor. And whereas Windsor Mayor Paul Beasley said this weekend the town received exceptional assistance from their local MLA, Chuck Porter, and Minister of Health Promotions, the Honourable Pat Dunn, for not only meeting with Council, but opening up the direct lines of communication between the town, the Department of Health Promotion, health officials, so to ensure pertinent information was available at all times, but also when establishing a rapid influenza clinic at the Hants Community Hospital for local citizens. Therefore, it be resolved that all members of the House of Assembly concur with Windsor Mayor Paul Beasley and recognize King Hitchhill Headmaster Joe Seagram, Hants West MLA Chuck Porter, Minister of Health Promotion Honourable Pat Dunn, healthcare and first responders officials demonstrating their collective leadership during a difficult time last week. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Aye. Against? Motion is carried. Order, please. The Honourable, the member for Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the band concert for Western Halifax County Schools will take place on Thursday, May 7, 2009 at Sir John A. Macdonald High School, and whereas music and the band program must remain an integral part of the school curriculum in Nova Scotia, and whereas this annual event, coordinated by legendary band teacher Jeffrey Stern, recognizes the accomplishments of band students and their dedicated teachers, therefore be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate and thank students, teachers, and parent volunteers for this work in presenting the annual school band concert at Sir John A. Macdonald High School this spring. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the member for Shelburne. The Honourable, the member, the Minister for Economic and Rural Development.
Is that right when I was paving?
Yeah. We didn't forget you when you were transferring.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's right. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Pit Players are a talented group of actors in Spring Hill and surrounding area, they give freely of their time and talents to not only entertain with their wonderful plays, but also to raise a tremendous amount of money for local charities. And whereas the Pit Players, who performed at the Wentworth Community Centre on Saturday evening to raise funds for Sunset Industries, have been in the business of entertaining for over 9 years, and in that time have raised approximately $100,000 for charities such as the Churches, Kidney Foundation, Mental Health Association, Sunset Industries, Special Olympics, and many, many more, Mr. Speaker. And whereas all the plays and songs are original scores written by Valerie Fahey, who is the playwright and director for the Pit Player group of actors, which includes Peter Bell, Roberta Bell, Aid Fahey, Susan McDonald, Robin Steves, Gail Murphy, Phil Scott, Laura Welch, Patty Colson, and Marilyn Williams. Therefore, be resolved, members of this House congratulate the Pit Players on their outstanding talents and charitable contributions to the many groups to which they donate, and wish them continued success in all future endeavours. Speaker, request waiver of notice and pass without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? The motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on April 5th, Nova Scotia Tween Provincial Ringette Team captured the gold medal at the Eastern Canadian Ringette Championships in Guelph, Ontario, and whereas the Nova Scotia team, competing against teams from Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, PEI, and the host from Guelph, finished their round-robin portion of play with 4 wins and 1 loss to move into the medal round. And whereas in the history of the Eastern Canadian Ringette Championships, this is the first gold medal for Nova Scotia team, therefore be it resolved that this House of Assembly congratulate Kaylee Dyson, Olivia Henwood, Alison Kinch, Kirsty Mason, Laura Patterson, Chelsea Wilkins, and Regan Wynn of the Cole Harbour Ringette Association on their 2009 Eastern Canadian Tween Championships gold medal. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
There has been a request for waiver. Is it agreed? All those in favour signify by saying aye. Against? Motion is carried. The Honourable, the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you.
Bill 240.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now call on bills for second reading.
Bills for second reading.
Would you please call bill number 240?
Bill number 240. On adjournment, it was the Honourable the Deputy Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to continue my comments with respect to Bill 240 before the legislature at this time. Mr. Speaker, we in this House have addressed the question that is before us now previously, and we addressed it previously in a very, very different economic time than today. In 2005, Nova Scotia was enjoying a very robust economy, as was Canada. Indeed, the world was riding the crest of very strong economic times. All over the world, trade was increasing. Global trade was increasing. There were economic opportunities for many, many people, and especially Nova Scotians, to be able to participate in that growing global economy. So in 2005, when the former Premier, through the assistance of the Government House Leader, was able to negotiate with Ottawa the offshore accord, the decision was taken, and it was a decision that was presented to this legislature that it would be appropriate for that money to be applied to the deficit. That, Mr. Speaker, was the context in which that decision was taken. Now, if we look at the current set of economic circumstances that are before us, we see the world in a very significant decline economically. We all are familiar with the history of the banking crises that occurred in the United States and the resultant loss of confidence around the world relative to the economy and the world economy. And we all have come to understand the extent to which we are interdependent upon the economies of the world. And in that context, Nova Scotia finds itself in the midst of preparing a budget for a presentation to the legislature to deal with the economy and the situation that presents itself to Nova Scotians. So we saw in the budget that was tabled by the Minister of Finance that we are in a situation where we are challenged with respect to our revenues, and as a result of being challenged with respect to those revenues, the government's choice is how do we go ahead and carry on in delivering services to the people of Nova Scotia, appropriate services. How do we participate with the Government of Canada in a stimulus package that allows us to increase our spending on capital by $800 million over the period of the stimulus package. Those were the challenges that presented themselves to us, Mr. Speaker. And that stimulus is very, very important if we're going to succeed in restoring the strength of our economy. Now, all members of the House would, of course, recall, and people in Nova Scotia recall, that there are three fundamental elements with respect to the operation of the economy. There is the consumer spending, there is spending by business, and there is spending by the public sector. And Mr. Speaker, we know that as a result of the worldwide recession, that business spending is declining very significantly. And indeed, the Minister of Finance pointed out that our revenues from the business sector are down. That's reflected in the decrease in activity. We saw, as a result of his budget, that our exports are down in this province, a province very dependent upon exports. So that is the economic climate in which the budget was presented. So you look at the decision that was taken in 2005, and you look at the circumstances that currently face us, and you say, is it appropriate to take that surplus, and that is the question we're debating here today, Mr. Speaker. The question is, how do you spend a surplus? Because that's revenue, it is legitimate revenue, and the legislature previously took the decision as to how it should be spent, and the legislature today is being asked to, in these economic circumstances, to look at how it would be spent in this circumstance. So that, there was the question before government: how do you go ahead and spend that surplus? So, Mr. Speaker, we have taken the decision that it should be applied to programs, that it should be applied in such a way that it would allow us to participate in the stimulus package. It meant that we would reassess how we would address the debt repayment program of this province, Mr. Speaker. And the ratio, the debt to GDP ratio, is one that has been commonly used, Mr. Speaker, and it reflects the state of what is happening within the economy. And that ratio is one which declined, as the Minister of Finance pointed out in his budget address, very significantly. So what is the role? What is the legitimate role of government when consumer spending is very iffy as a result of confidence in the economy, when business investment is declining? Is it the role of the government to sit back on its hands and not participate in the economy in order to keep the growth in the economy going? And as I listen to the other side, Mr. Speaker, I see no indication from them, I see no recognition from them that government has a legitimate role to increase its spending at a time when the economy is in recession. Mr. Speaker, we did hear, I listened very, very carefully to the debate on this bill and to the comments that were made with respect to the budget for the alternatives that were going to be presented by the official opposition and by the third party in this House, Mr. Speaker. And I did detect one hint of an alternate economic program that came from the third party when they spoke of reduction in the small business tax. Well, Mr. Speaker, if that is the only economic proposal that comes from the other side of the House with respect to dealing with the current recession, we are in very difficult circumstance if they should ever form the government of this province, Mr. Speaker. Because as good a suggestion as the reduction in the small business tax is, the time required for that to take an effect to stimulate the economy is just too long for us to be able to address the current recession that we're in. It would take too long, and it's not enough. Mr. Speaker, it is common knowledge from any high school economics student that at a time of recession, government should increase its spending. And the Minister of Finance today, tabled a budget that did just that. Mr. Speaker, it not only did that, but it took advantage of the program of the Government of Canada with respect to stimulus spending. It preserved jobs in the public sector of this province, Mr. Speaker. It ensured the continuation of programs and good programs, and indeed it referenced the increase in those programs such as telehealth care for the people of this province. So, Mr. Speaker, this government has acted very responsibly in asking the legislature to consider what it should do with a surplus that was generated as a result of the Crown share. In an economic condition where the revenues of this province are severely challenged, where the country itself is in recession. Mr. Speaker, we have heard a great deal from the opposition about process. They say that this bill shouldn't be here. We had an argument about whether or not the budget could come down first or not. We resolved that, but last week's arguments were about process. This week's discussion, as I listened to the opposite side, Mr. Speaker, related not to what was in this budget, but their concerns about what would be in future budgets. And the Minister of Finance, Mr. Speaker, addressed many of the concerns with respect to what would be in future budgets when he indicated that indeed we do have a very difficult challenges ahead of us, and to that end we need to take steps and take steps to examine how we deliver programs. That's part and parcel of the reason that the Chief Information Officer was created in this province, was taken from Economic Development and put with Treasury and Policy Board so that we can use technologies available to allow government to deliver their services far more efficiently than is now the case. And that, Mr. Speaker, we are working on that. People are employed in doing that now, and as we move forward to future budgets, we will employ the results of their work in order to ensure that we're able to continue to deliver programs that will fit the needs of Nova Scotians. So, Mr. Speaker, for anyone to suggest that we have not effectively looked at that alternative is missing the point of what the Minister of Finance said so very clearly. Now, I listened very carefully, Mr. Speaker, last week when the honourable member for Halifax Fairview held up the piece of legislation, and he said that Nova Scotians would not understand what that piece of legislation said. And he read from the one line in the legislation. But what he very conveniently omitted, Mr. Speaker, is what this government did to ensure that Nova Scotians understood the legislation, and that is he omitted the preamble to that legislation, which set out clearly the reasons why and the intent of the legislation. And Mr. Speaker, the preamble says where Nova Scotia's enshrined in legislation balanced budgets and has since tabled 7 consecutive balanced budgets, and whereas this fiscal stability has been a key to realizing improved credit worthiness from major bond rating agencies year after year, and whereas an eighth balanced budget during the current global economic uncertainty is key to continuing positive economic growth and refraining from additional borrowing to cover the alternative of a deficit, and whereas amending legislation is necessary to move forward the 2009-10 budget and the accompanying Building for Growth stimulus package in order to create and maintain 20,000 jobs and to keep the economy moving. And whereas the alternative to this is cuts to core government services and to the jobs of the people who administer those programs and services. And is it any wonder, Mr. Speaker, that he chose to omit that part of the legislation? Because the preamble sets clearly for the people of Nova Scotia why we are debating this legislation today. And it sets clearly the need for the legislature of this province to recognize there must be a change of course with respect to how we spend the surplus. So, Mr. Speaker, listening very carefully to the opposite side of the House, you wonder how is it that they would have dealt with the circumstances that face this government and the circumstance that face the Minister of Finance. What is it that they would have done? Well, Mr. Speaker, with the exception of the reduction in the small business tax from the third party, I have heard nothing. So, Mr. Speaker, because they will not address how they would handle the challenges facing this province, because they are not prepared to address that, then it's legitimate for the people of Nova Scotia to start asking the question, what is it that they would do, Mr. Speaker? What is it that they would do? Not only to balance this budget, but to pay for the $2 billion of promises made by the NDP party, the risky NDP. What is it that they would do, Mr. Speaker? We have heard nothing from them. Not a word, Mr. Speaker, in terms of how they would address this situation. They hide behind process, they talk about process, but they do not speak to the essence of what the budget is about. Now, Mr. Speaker, as we debate this measure before us, it's appropriate for Nova Scotians to pose the question, would you, in order to balance the budget, because they both said there had to be a balanced budget, so would you, in order to balance the budget, decrease programs by $200 million? That's a legitimate question for the people of Nova Scotia to ask. Okay? You're way ahead of me because I'm, what are the consequences of decreasing the expenditures? If you did it entirely on the basis of employment, and about 70% of our costs are related to the employment of individuals, and in some sectors, the healthcare sector, it is even more than that. If you were to look in that area, then the $200 million, Mr. Speaker, is upwards of 4,000 jobs for Nova Scotians. Is that what they would put on the table? 4,000 jobs, Mr. Speaker? Is that their alternative? They owe it to the people of Nova Scotia to tell them what their alternative is. Now, or they could cut services. The Minister of Finance used an example last week that I won't repeat because people didn't like it, but it was an example, that's all. But there are many things that could happen. Would they cut back the RIM program from the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure Renewal? Would they take that $20 million out of maintenance? Now, we know that one party over there has done that. They did it in the past in order to try. They didn't even balance the budget, but they cut the money. They cut the money for maintenance, and they cut it, significantly. So is that what they would do, Mr. Speaker? Or, Mr. Speaker, would they say Nova Scotia should not participate in the infrastructure program? Is that the question? Is that how they would answer the question? Would they go back to the days of $44 million in transportation budget for capital instead of the $345 million that we are proposing in this budget, Mr. Speaker? Is that their solution? Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians need to ask them that question. How would they deal with this $200 million challenge, plus more than $200 million? Mr. Speaker, if that's the best answer, they can provide, Nova Scotians will see to it that they never come over here.
Order, please. Order. The Honourable the Deputy Premier.
Time moves rapidly when you're having fun, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, there's the one. Now I'll get to the or. You know, and Nova Scotians could ask many other questions than I posed here today about how they would deal with reduced program spending in order to balance the budget without the spending of the surplus in the manner which we have put forward. The other side of the coin, of course, is that they could come up with $200 million with additional revenues, Mr. Speaker. That is we use words revenues here. The people outside this chamber know what we're talking about. We're talking about tax increases. Now, Mr. Speaker, we've heard nothing from them with respect to tax increases, Mr. Speaker, and they have said nothing about how they're going to deal with the $200 million deficit, Mr. Speaker. So Nova Scotians legitimately should ask them, are you going to increase taxes to cover the $200 million shortfall and the $2 billion in promises that you've made, Mr. Speaker? Is that what you're going to do? Nova Scotians have the right to know the answer to that question, Mr. Speaker. They have the right. They have the right to know that the opposition is not hiding behind process, but are out there talking about what they would do in the current circumstances, Mr. Speaker. Now, we have, Mr. Speaker, in this budget, set forward a plan to allow us to provide the stimulus to the economy. They have hid behind process in order to avoid dealing with the issue of whether they would cut programs, whether they would increase taxes, whether they would do a combination of both. And then there is the stimulus package. So if they say that we should take advantage of the stimulus package with the federal government, which I have not heard them say, but if they were to say that we should take advantage of that, how then would they find the money in order to take advantage of that? What is it that they would do to find that money, Mr. Speaker? Well, somebody suggested to me the other day they would take the offshore offset, they would apply it to the debt, then they would go out and borrow the money that they needed in order to proceed with the stimulus package. Well, here's my Visa card, and I'm going to use it to pay down my MasterCard. Is that the logic that they're going to employ, Mr. Speaker, in order to take advantage of the stimulus package? Or, Mr. Speaker, are they saying by implication that they would not take advantage of the stimulus package being presented here, that they would not proceed with the opportunity to create and maintain 20,000 jobs in this province? Is that what their alternative is, Mr. Speaker? Nova Scotians have a right to know. They have a right to know, is it tax increases? Is it program cuts? Is it delaying or not participating in the stimulus package? That, Mr. Speaker, at a time when this province is facing very serious economic challenges. That at a time, Mr. Speaker, when government has a responsibility to step up to the plate and to do responsible borrowing in order to stimulate the economy, in order to keep people working, in order to restore confidence in the economy and maintain that confidence in the economy until such time as the private sector starts to invest again. Then it is legitimate, Mr. Speaker, for government to pull back and proceed with normal levels of spending. Now, it's very interesting, Mr. Speaker. It's not the principle that the third party is opposed to with respect to this legislation, because they have already indicated that it's the retroactivity they're opposed to. So they would, on a go-forward basis, they would take this money and they would go ahead and use it for programs. But they want to trigger an election, so they're going to hide behind the issue of retroactivity so that they can trigger the election. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's what all of this debate is about. It's about the opposition parties trying to position themselves to trigger an election in this province so that they feel they don't have to take responsibility for it. Well, Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians know. And I spoke to many Nova Scotians on the weekend, Mr. Speaker, and they know that to precipitate an election at this time is not in the interest of the people of the province of Nova Scotia.
Order, please. Order. Order, please. The Honourable Deputy Premier has the floor.
So, Mr. Speaker, the challenge is for them to decide what is appropriate, what is in the best interests of the people of the province of Nova Scotia. And let me tell you, Mr. Speaker, that on the weekend I was on the campus of St. Francis Xavier University, where there was tremendous excitement about the fact that the stimulus package is going to provide them with the opportunity to proceed with the $22 million project for the Schwartz Business School. Mr. Speaker, they were excited about that. And they want that project to proceed, Mr. Speaker, but we need the stimulus package for that to proceed, Mr. Speaker. It's as simple as that, and they know it. They know it on the campus of St. FX. They know what this issue is all about, and they understand it very carefully. Now, also, Mr. Speaker, you drive through Antigonish, you can see that the new 104's right-of-way has been cut, and you can see that there will be 2 structures built this year as the beginning of that project, and those structures will take advantage of federal dollars, Mr. Speaker, that's going to go to that project. Well, that we never got a cent out of the previous federal Liberal government to proceed with that project, but it didn't take long to get the commitment from the current federal government to proceed with that project. Oh, okay. I was misunderstanding the Speaker's signals, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, we in this side of the House have presented to the people of Nova Scotia a budget that was very considered. It was tough, there's no question about that, but it does require the legislature to look at a decision it took in 2005 and to see whether that decision is appropriate in 2009. It's to look at a situation where in 2005 we had a very strong, robust economy in the province of Nova Scotia. In 2009, we are in the midst of a worldwide recession. What is the appropriate thing for government to do? And that's what this debate is about, Mr. Speaker. It's how you spend a surplus. That, Mr. Speaker, is the question before the House. Now, I listened, Mr. Speaker, to members of the opposition in talking about the forecasts. Well, Mr. Speaker, I will take the Department of Finance's forecasts in the province of Nova Scotia and stack them against any private sector forecaster anywhere. Because if you look, Mr. Speaker, if you look at the forecasts by the Department of Finance in this province over the last 7 to 8 years, you will find that they were very, very consistent and very accurate in terms of their forecasts. Now, some difficulties in this year, and understandable difficulties, Mr. Speaker, because at the time we presented the budget last year, it was very difficult to anticipate that we would be in the circumstance we're in this year with respect to the recession. And it was so difficult, Mr. Speaker, to anticipate that last year during the estimates before this House, the estimates that are so important from the perspective of the economy, the estimates of the department, at that time, the Department of Economic Development, were not even called by the opposition to be examined and debated, Mr. Speaker. They were not even called. That's how important they thought the economy was a year ago, that they did not call the estimates of the Department of Economic Development. Now, Mr. Speaker, what does that speak to? Does that speak to the fact that they don't have any ideas with respect to the economy? Does it speak to the fact that they thought we were doing a great job? I don't think they would admit to that, but we thought we were, Mr. Speaker. But it does point to the fact that the economy was not a priority with the opposition parties, Mr. Speaker. They did not take the economy seriously a year ago, because the most important opportunity for them to examine the policies and the expenditures within the Department of Economic Development was last year during the estimate debates. And what decision did they take? They said, we don't need to examine those expenditures. They're not important enough for us to bother examining. So, Mr. Speaker, now no wonder we can't get from them any specifics with respect to how they would deal with the current challenge before this economy. Mr. Speaker, this question is a question about how the legislature should address the issue of a surplus in the time of very, very severe economic challenges. We submit, Mr. Speaker, that given the change between 2005 and 2009, that it is appropriate for us to present this measure to the legislature to provide the additional $200+ million for program spending in this province. Program spending that will preserve jobs, program spendings that will preserve programs of government, Mr. Speaker, and spending that will allow us to take advantage of the stimulus package. Not to do that, Mr. Speaker, is to put jobs at risk, to put government programs at risk, to vacate the opportunity to take advantage of the federal stimulus package. That's the decision taken by the opposition. We have taken the decision that it is better to spend money on programs, it is better to keep people employed, it is better to be able to take advantage of the most significant stimulus package this province has seen in its history. Mr. Speaker, I intend to vote for this motion.
Order, please. Order. Chair recognizes the Honourable the Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it's my pleasure to join the debate on this bill, which is an amendment to the Provincial Finance Act. And I'd like to start by just saying that there are moments when we're in this House and pieces of legislation that come forward have tremendous gravity in their intent and in their effect. And I don't think that's could be any more true than this particular piece of legislation, because the truth of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, that the government considers this to be a confidence motion, and therefore the actual life of the government hangs in the balance on this decision. And so, for the government members they say this, but I don't really think they believe it. If they thought that it was being I guess they tell people that that's being treated in a cavalier manner by the members of the opposition. But I know that they know that that's not the case. That is political posturing. In fact, Mr. Speaker, every one of us who sat on this side, and I give the same credit to the members of the Liberal caucus as I do to my own members. We weigh this very heavily. We understand the consequences, and we understand that we have to take responsibility not for just a vote against it, but we would for a vote in favor of it too. I've said this before with respect to budgetary votes, and so I don't think of this as anything that should be treated in any manner except with the utmost seriousness, and that's what we have brought to bear in the examination of the piece of legislation, and it is the way that we have addressed our mind to it. We have addressed our collective mind in caucus to this piece of legislation, and I think it's important that people understand the kinds of things that went into the consideration of this bill. We've reflected on it carefully, and I would begin by saying, Mr. Speaker, we've been not here in this House for 5 months, and over that course of time, there has been very little in the way of consultation from the government. They never really asked our opinion with respect to the course that they were proceeding with. They never provided us with information. They didn't bring in an economic update. They didn't attempt to try and get the opposition to understand the position that they were advancing. That was just, and they can say what they like, that just didn't happen. So the intention of this bill, of bringing this bill in, is to try and represent a situation not only past but one current that simply doesn't exist. Now, you've heard the last member, you've heard the member for Antigonish speak, and he keeps referring to the spending of a surplus, Mr. Speaker, and there is no surplus. What happened, and all of the members over here have been around as long as I have, and they were certainly around in 2005, or many of them, I shouldn't say all of them. They were around in 2005 when the Atlantic Accord was actually negotiated. And when the accord was that's right, and the Minister of Justice signed the deal. And he knows that the terms of that deal was for this money to be paid down on the debt. The money was received, and it was paid on to the debt of it was paid on the debt. You should check, you should read the agreement if you're going to sign them. The actual terms of the actual terms of it was that it was put down on the debt in 2005. All of it, not some of it, all of it. It was paid down. And you know something? The members of this caucus and my recollection is the members of the Liberal caucus agreed with that. We said, you know, this is a great day for Nova Scotia. This is a day in which the settlement of this agreement is going to mean a significant decrease in the debt burden of the province. And you know, we gave credit to Dr. Ham on that day, and in fact have given him credit many times since then for his diligent work. He proceeded with this. It was his intention that the money should be paid down on the debt, and that all of us as legislators and the people we represent would reap the benefit of that. That the interest that would not be paid to bankers in New York and Toronto instead would go into program spending. So that's what happened in 2005. Now, for reasons associated with counting, the members opposite know this, that it was an advance payment and therefore had to be amortized over the years to come to meet the criteria set out in accounting principles, rather, Mr. Speaker. So the money was paid down the debt. So today, for example, Mr. Speaker, I asked Department of Finance officials whether or not if this money from the Atlantic Accord was going to be applied to last year, how that would have to happen. And their answer was pretty simple, that they would have to reacquire the money by a debt issue. That they would have to go into debt in order to reacquire that money in order to treat it as if it were revenue in last year, which it clearly is not. And that is the problem, Mr. Speaker. That's the fundamental problem with this bill. This is the fundamental problem with this, is that it misrepresents to the people of the province the actual state of the books last year, and tries to hide, Mr. Speaker, a deficit that the government has decided to incur in this year. Now, you know, that and this bill attempts to ask the members of the opposition to be complicit in that attempt to hide what happened last year and what's happening this year from the people of the province. And I don't think, Mr. Speaker, that that's a fair thing for a government to ask the opposition to participate in, because I believe that we should treat the people of the province with respect. We should have the fortitude to present an honest picture of what has happened, not only in the previous budget years, but what's happening in this year. And this bill, Mr. Speaker, does not do that, Mr. Speaker. This bill attempts to hide the reality of the situation from the people of the province, and that is something up with which we cannot put. I want to talk, because they talked a lot about various aspects and effects of this bill. I want to just talk about some of them. They talked about the question of increasing spending during a time of a recession. You know, Mr. Speaker, we have I think the second highest per capita debt in the country, right behind Newfoundland. And Newfoundland, as you know, has resources that are and resource income that put them in a better position than we are to deal with that kind of massive debt. Last year, we paid out some $900 million on that interest on that debt. $900 million that can't go to program spending, can't go to health, can't go to education, can't go to roads or to tax relief, if that's what they chose. The plan of the government, Mr. Speaker, is to add $1.5 billion more to that debt, to push the interest costs on the debt to over $1 billion a year, Mr. Speaker. To push the debt servicing cost to over $1 billion a year, and to shackle future governments with that debt, something that I just can't believe that the government led by Dr. Ham would agree with. I can't believe that. In fact, he fought throughout the time that he was here, and we all sat across the aisle from him to see to it that that didn't happen. And it is ironic it is ironic that this government will wipe out the progress made by the Ham government, and it is ironic that the defenders of that program turn out to be on the opposition benches. Mr. Speaker, the member from Antigonish raised the question of taxes. You know, Mr. Speaker, the people who have raised taxes in this province consistently sat on the government side of the benches. Just a short time ago, they issued what amounted to a catalog of increases in user fees that touched virtually every user fee in the province. They call them user fees, but they're taxes. That's what they are. And many of them, in fact, have been necessarily put in as taxation measures, because although they continue to be called user fees, by law they're actually taxes. And then, Mr. Speaker, it is that government over there that decided to reimpose an additional 8% tax on the basic electricity cost that affected every single homeowner in the province, Mr. Speaker. So these are the people over here who have been increasing taxes, and it is these people on this side who have been voting against tax increases, Mr. Speaker. And we're not. The suggestion that somehow we want to raise taxes is a fantasy that belongs only to them, because they want to believe that they're not dealing with the opposition that sets across the aisle from them. They want to believe that they're dealing with some made-up opposition that they can try and sell to people. But sooner or later, they're going to have to actually deal with the people who are sitting across the aisle from them. Now, So that's the result of the taxation. As I pointed out, this will add some $1.4 billion to the debt of the province. So here's the next piece of this, Mr. Speaker, because I kept hearing the member from Antigonish talk about what the question will be. Why is it that the opposition won't vote for this bill? They want to precipitate an election. Well, why is it that this government brought this bill forward? When they have heard from the opposition parties, they know that they're not prepared to vote in favor of it. It is because, in fact, it is the government that wishes to precipitate an election, and they simply want to use this as a device in which to try and transfer the blame over to the opposition parties, Mr. Speaker. But you know something? I'll tell you what the question is going to be. The question is going to be on people's minds whenever that election happens, and if it happens as a result of the vote this evening or tomorrow. The question will be, does the MacDonald government deserve to be reelected? That will be the question on people's minds. And they will reflect on all of these things. They will reflect on the immigration scandal, Mr. Speaker, that has rocked this House. They will reflect on the ATV decision. They will reflect on the increases of 8% on the basic electricity rate on every household, just at the same time that Nova Scotia Power was applying for a 9% increase. It meant that as of the 1st of January, Mr. Speaker, consumers in this province are paying almost 18% more than they paid last year on their basic electricity rates. It was a terrible decision for some of the reasons that the minister over there understands, which is that that's essentially taking money out of the hands of people who would otherwise spend it and put it into the economy, and it's putting it instead into the government's hands. That's what a lot of economists say. A lot of economists will tell them that one of the most effective ways to fight a recession is to make sure that people have money to spend, and that's why we on this side have been trying to convince the government to take a rather reasonable and rational approach, which is to simply lobby their friends in Ottawa, which are so proud to be so close to change the EI rules, so that money can actually put, so that fund can actually put money in the hands of people who need it, and secondly, can be used for job training, for reskilling of the labor force that we're going to need in order to move forward in the economy, Mr. Speaker. Now, he says, Mr. Speaker, the member for Antigonish says, I haven't heard anything from the NDP about the economy, and yet, Mr. Speaker, I've tabled a bill with respect to a manufacturers and processors tax credit, Mr. Speaker, to try and incent business to make the investments now that will increase productivity, increase the number of jobs in the province, Mr. Speaker, by more than 2,000. And you know something? That estimate doesn't come from these benches. That estimate actually came from the government, Mr. Speaker. They are the ones who carried out the cost-benefit analysis, looked at the program and said, this would be good for the economy of the province, Mr. Speaker. It is us on this side who have set out the necessity of this province to become a learning province, to make sure that we have the capacity in our community college to provide the apprentices, the internships, the mentorship programs, Mr. Speaker, that will give young people at an early opportunity a hands-on experience that will make them an effective part of the labor force, Mr. Speaker. That's been the people on this side of the House who have been talking about how we go about actually leveraging the capacity of the government to take advantage of the stimulus package that the federal government has proposed. Mr. Speaker, last year we had something in the order of $500 million that was set forward for capital spending. And how do we go about using that money in order to leverage as much as we can out of the government? Now, Mr. Speaker, the question for the Premier is a pretty straightforward one. I mean, he has used this opportunity. He has used this opportunity to try and castigate the opposition. And it has been us that have been promoting the early and necessary production of a stimulus package. Mr. Speaker, it was the government that became among the last governments in the country to bring forward anything. And what have they brought forward? They have brought forward a campaign list of announcements around the province, one after another, not tying them to timetables. In fact, Mr. Speaker, what we know is that they have long lists of promises they made before and didn't keep. The Truro interchange is a good example of one of a promise that was made in 2003. They didn't keep it then, and now they say, well, we know we broke that promise last time, but honest, this time we mean it. And that's the case. The school building, Mr. Speaker, was a 2003 list that they didn't keep their promise on, and now they've stuck them into this year's campaign announcements, and they expect people to simply believe that that is the basis on which they're going to go forward in our economy. We have seen extraordinary poor planning from this government. We have seen a lack of business rigor. We have seen careless spending. $300 million, Mr. Speaker, squandered in the last few days of a frenzy. And, even the Auditor General said that in those years that they spent them in the last. And the minister refers to the university funding, and he knows that I'm not referring to that. It was in the 2006, 2007 budgets. They just couldn't spend it fast enough. even though the debt management plan that Mr. Ham put out said that all that money should go on the debt. They decided instead that they would waste it. So, you know, Mr. Speaker, they spent money without the auditor, without even ever bringing it to the House of Assembly for anyone to have an opportunity to sign off on it, Mr. Speaker. They spent money, as the Auditor General pointed out, without any oversight by the House of Assembly, who has the legitimate right to do that. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, I've spoken long enough. We're not going to be supporting this piece of legislation for all of the reasons that I have set out. And you know, I just think it's a shame that this government has decided that instead of being honest with the people of Nova Scotia, they are going to try to engage in this kind of a deceptive behavior that, you know, I will withdraw.
Order, please.
They're going to engage in behavior which I believe does not honestly represent the end result of the bill, which, you know, in my view, simply. Well, I'm right. You know. Okay, Mr. Speaker. With that, I'll take my place.
If I recognize the minister, it'll be to close debate. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
To close debate on this bill and ask you to call the vote.
Order, please. I can't hear the minute.
Mr. Speaker, I move to close debate.